Next week's online expo will be highlighting some of our nonprofits in South King County. Find out more on our website at www.kingcounty.gov/giving. Thank you for attending today's session about Hurricane Dorian and natural disaster relief. We're excited to have 3 organizations here with us today: International Relief Teams, American Red Cross, and World Vision. Everyone in the audience is muted. However, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. At the end of all 3 presentations, we will have a time for Q&A. There will be a short survey posted in the chat box at the end of today's session. This survey is your entry into our passport drawing on November 15th. First up, please help me welcome Jenna Montgomery, Communications Specialist at International Relief Teams.
Okay, hi, can you hear me? And let me see if you can see my slides. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you guys so much for having me. We're excited to talk to you about International Relief Teams and specifically our work in disaster relief. So we do other humanitarian projects that are related to addressing endemic poverty, but we also specialize in disaster relief, and that's what we'll talk about today. So we've been around for 31 years. We're still run by our founder, who's our CEO. He had a successful law practice and then quit that to start this nonprofit, thinking that he could do a lot better in the world. And 31 years later, we're still here. We've been working in over 70 countries around the world, responding to most major disasters, and also sending medicines and doing some other humanitarian work. So we look at disasters in 2 phases. The first phase, is the immediate relief. It's really about sustaining life. And how we do that is by sending food, water, shelter, medicines, and any other necessary supplies that are going to help keep people alive and sustain the teams that are on the ground. We also, depending on the situation, will send volunteer teams of doctors and nurses. As you can see, that photo is from the Haiti earthquake in 2010, which, if you remember, killed about 200,000 people and was a huge disaster. And that was that's a photo of our medical team there on the ground. And then there's the long-term recovery. And this is often the step that people forget about, because after the media stops covering a disaster, maybe, just a few days or a few weeks that it's in the news, there's a long recovery process to get families who've lost their homes, they've lost their farms, their livelihoods, their businesses, and they're on a fixed income, or they were already in a bad situation and they just can't get back on their feet. And so we will stay months, years after the fact to help them rebuild their homes, just depending on the situation. So right now we are working in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian, which was a Category 5 hurricane and the strongest on record to hit the Bahamas, and absolutely devastated 2 of the northern islands of the island nation. So we responded immediately and working with our on-site partners by sending supplies. So sending giant sea containers filled with the supplies that we're told, are most immediately needed. So often we send ready-to-eat meals immediately, and then in a few weeks we'll send canned food. We'll send tarps, for people who need to stay protected from the rain and the sun, send solar lights, generators, diapers and baby wipes and baby formula. And that's all that we've done so far, but we're continuing to send supplies. It would hit about 6 weeks ago, but people are still devastated, still relying on this aid to stay alive. And to feed their families, because if you imagine if they lost their homes, they have lost all of their possessions. They have no way to feed themselves or their family. And so these supplies are crucial. They're life-saving. And so that's the first step. Once the situation settles and they start to do the recovery and rebuilding, then we'll evaluate the situation and see what we can do, where we can fill in the gaps and where we can help rebuild. So currently we are working in Northern California. If you remember, the 2018 wildfires last year were the largest and most destructive in history. They were all over the state, but especially in Northern California. So we did some immediate response by sending supplies, immediately following that, for people living in shelters and for schools that were burnt down. But now, we're still there, and we're sending volunteer skilled construction teams to actually rebuild homes for fire victims from the ground up. So these are homes that were completely destroyed, and we're completely rebuilding them. But, it's over a year, and these people still don't have a place to live. And so these are the people who, they kind of fall through the cracks of, our safety net, where they were underinsured or didn't have insurance. They were elderly, they're disabled, they just don't have the means to rebuild their home. And so that's where we will step in. And, we do this kind of work a lot. We were in Louisiana following Hurricane Harvey, rebuilding homes there. We were in Mississippi for 6 years following Hurricane Katrina. Sometimes that's how long it takes to be able to rebuild homes for people. We were in New Jersey for 4 years following Superstorm Sandy, and those are just some of the recent ones. We're also still working in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria, which, if you remember, in 2017 just completely devastated the island. And we're actually, instead of sending labor, because there's so many people that need jobs there, we are hiring local labor and buying local construction supplies to try and help stimulate the economy and rebuilding homes there. So these, are two disasters you often hear about in the news. You hear about wildfires, you hear about hurricanes, but then there's another kind of disaster, which are man-made disasters like war. So, for example, you probably aren't hearing a lot about the Syrian war in the news and the devastation that is still ongoing there. And we are working with one of the last organizations on the ground in the rebel-held areas like Idlib province, delivering life-saving medicines and medical supplies. And where we work in other war areas, we're helping. We help other, refugee crises, and these are sort of long-term, ongoing disasters, or what we think of as man-made disasters. So, I'm sorry, I did not flip that slide for you. Okay. So yeah, more disasters than ever. This past year, we have responded to more disasters than ever before. It was just a huge year for us. And I think it just shows the trend that we're on. There's bigger hurricanes, bigger fires, war. I mean, there's always been war and refugees. It's just maybe on a larger scale right now, and that's why we're responding to more. So this is a list of the disasters we responded to just last year. And for a small organization, we're a staff of 7 people. We're very small. These are all the ones we either sent volunteer teams or we sent supplies to. So from Louisiana and Puerto Rico, which I mentioned, we responded to the big hurricanes last year in Florida and North Carolina. There has been an ongoing famine situation in Somalia and East Africa. It's also combined with issues of war and refugees, sending supplies there. Same with, there was a huge cyclone in Malawi and Mozambique, which killed 1,000 people. And we've sent over 1 million meals to families that lost absolutely everything. and we've been responding to refugees in Lebanon and Bangladesh, as well as in Iraq. So this is just the scope of our disaster relief programs right now. Yeah, and please let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jenna. Now we would like to welcome Julie Kent, Corporate Relations Officer, American Red Cross.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here today sharing the good work of the Red Cross, and that was a great presentation with the international relief teams. I see so many similarities in what we do. It's very heartwarming to hear. Today, I wanted to share what the Red Cross has done, particularly in the efforts around Hurricane Dorian that hit just about 6 weeks ago. And to start off, just to, most people have heard of the Red Cross, but just wanted to share the exact mission that we are trying to achieve, and that is to prevent and alleviate human suffering in the face of emergencies by mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. That is the crux of what we try to accomplish in all that we do. And certainly as the word of Hurricane Dorian starting to approach, we start to activate what we do, which is our response to an event like that. Here on this screen, you can see we do many other services on a daily basis, so disasters and home fire, biomed. Red Cross is the leading nonprofit that brings in blood donations in the nation. We also service our armed forces and international services, as well as training services where we do CPR and first aid training. So when word of Hurricane Dorian approaching, one of the first things that happens is we start to mobilize our volunteers. We are a volunteer-led organization, 90% volunteer run, which is great for us. Just appreciate our volunteers so much stepping up. And as a storm is starting to approach, where we're seeing concern for Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and also the Bahamas, it's always interesting to me that as people are trying to move away from that storm that live there, our volunteers are heading into that storm. They're in our emergency response vehicles, which you can see on the slide there on the top right, which we call ERVs. And people are headed down to start putting shelters up and start preparing for what may be a really, really bad storm that may hit the Bahamas and may hit some parts of the United States. All in all, we had about 2,800 volunteers head down that way and also over to the Bahamas. 110 of these emergency response vehicles also headed, many of them loaded with supplies that were going to be needed. 104 tractor trailer loads full of relief supplies. And of course, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Storms are unpredictable. So, as every little turn, it's getting worse, it's slowing down, it's changing direction. Us and other relief organizations are tracking that and saying, where do we need to have our people? Where do we need to put our supplies? It's a very It changes every day, and I'm glad that I'm not the person who has to figure all of that out, but we have some amazing people at the Red Cross keeping track on that and making sure that our supplies and our volunteers are where they need to be. The storm was very unpredictable, and as most of us know, the brunt of that storm hit the Bahamas. We were fortunate, even though we were ready in our southern part of the United States. Fortunately, that did not see too much damage. The Bahamas is really where the big challenges hit. Once that storm hit, we had volunteers in place. We had supplies coming. We had to start opening, had shelters open. All in all, through the worst of that storm, we ended up sheltering over 38,000 people between the southern states in America and in Bahamas. There were a lot of people that had to evacuate their homes. Even fortunately, not as much happened over here. And also, we had to distribute about 350 units of blood between Bahamas and the United States for people that had been injured. There's some people that need blood on a daily basis. And when a storm hits the Bahamas or places such as that, a lot of times that blood supply is cut off. And certainly, I know there were many blood drives that had to be canceled because of the storms. So in that time, that's where Red Cross blood comes together, and we will start moving a blood supply from other parts of the United States to the affected areas. And what was interesting for us in this particular disaster, as it may have been for other organizations, is this was both a national and an international disaster that we were responding to. So the wonderful power of the Red Cross is we are able to shift volunteers and supplies and blood donations not only to our nationwide disasters, but also to international disasters. Once those shelters are set up, we start to also bring in nurses. You're going to see people with injuries. You're going to start seeing people that weren't able to grab their prescriptions before they left. So in the shelters that are set up, you're going to see people that are able to receive first aid care, and also there are counselors in there offering psychological first aid, not only to the people that have evacuated, but sometimes to the volunteers. The folks that head out on these emergency response vehicles that are passing out food and blankets, they're often the people that are driving amongst the devastation that has happened. They're often the people that have people come up to the window that have lost pets, have lost family members, and right there on the spot, they end up offering psychological first aid to the people that have been affected. And sometimes when they come home at the end of the day, they also need to talk to somebody. So Red Cross makes sure that we have psychological first aid available to everyone. Also in the Bahamas, the Red Cross responded more than 20 disaster folks to help deal with the IT communications issues that were happening in the Bahamas. That's an important part of getting people back on their feet. And so Red Cross made sure we had a part in helping that start to recover, and also giving us the ability to communicate and make sure that we were getting the supplies we needed and getting people back on their feet. Once everybody's, the storm has passed and everybody's recovering, the next thing that Red Cross does is we start to offer financial aid to the people that are affected. They can we usually have a website set up where people can go on and apply for that financial aid. They can also come to the shelter and talk directly to one of the caseworkers and start to get that financial assistance. And one of the main things that we try to do is we're very, very, very careful to make sure that if a donor says that they want their money to go to people affected by Hurricane Dorian, that's where it goes. And that's the money that is turned, back into the hands of the people trying to recover. And in cases where we've raised more money than what we have had to put out, we will sometimes go through a secondary round of financial assistance to people. We will stick around and make sure that use those funds to also get people back on their feet to rebuild the supplies that have been used. So many times after a disaster, the cupboards are empty. People have used the water, they've used the supplies, they need to replace cots, they need to replace blankets. So funds that are raised, particularly if we have an abundance of funds, we will use those to make sure that before we leave, that community has its preparedness supplies filled back up. We're also making sure that people have hygiene kits. Again, a lot of people have had to leave and weren't able to bring everything that they needed with them. So we're making sure that they have shampoo, a bar of soap, a comb, some things like that. So, really the goal is to give dignity. That's our goal. We want to give people hope and dignity after something so difficult has happened to them. And being able to give them clean clothes and a nice place to sleep and a nice warm meal is a great first step in getting them there. So right now, currently, the Red Cross is still in the Bahamas, is still helping people to get back on their feet. We still have caseworkers there that are still continuing to offer mental health services. We do still have people there trying to, can offer financial aid to people. We are still bringing in supplies for what is needed for people that are trying to get back on their feet. And I wanted to close this with this wonderful quote that I saw. I just went to look up some stories from the volunteers that are working there still in the Bahamas. And this one really touched me from one of our volunteers. And she was referring to some folks that she was helping there. And she says, "He sat in front of me with his 8-month-old, telling me he was just trying to be a man as he held their mattress over their head as the roof blew off. I listened and gave him his cash card. I said, 'You can stay here as long as you need to. Just sit if you'd like.' And in that moment, I could see his body just relax." And that's our goal, to get people back on their feet with a sense of hope and dignity.
Thank you, Julie. Finally, here to talk to us about natural disaster relief work in general, we welcome Mike Bassett, Director, Domestic Humanitarian and Emergency Affairs from World Vision.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank my fellow presenters, Julie and Jenna. In this line of work, there's a lot of collaboration, and it takes a big heart, and there's a lot of hope that's offered, but there's a lot of taxing on the staff sometimes when we deliver these services. So I just like to thank them for all they do for people in need, especially in times of disaster. And I'd like to thank everybody of the King County employees for allowing me to share about our work. I'm the director for U.S. disaster work. We do have a global team that does international responses as well, but I'll just talk about our U.S. work because that's what I'm more familiar with. Let me just let you know who World Vision is as a whole, and we're an international Christian humanitarian aid organization. We work in nearly 100 countries around the world, including the United States, and World Vision is working to help communities lift themselves out of poverty around the globe. We're committed to eradicating extreme poverty and putting an end to the global water crisis and providing disaster relief for people who have had their lives turned upside down by a disaster. We work with some of the most vulnerable people on earth, people living in extreme poverty, refugees, migrants, and disaster survivors. At World Vision, we have the heart and the passion and the commitment and the drive to work with the most vulnerable people. So today I'd like to share about World Vision's U.S. Disaster Response Program. World Vision has responded to a lot of disasters around the U.S., from hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and wildfires. We also consider humanitarian crises as disaster work as well. In the United States, we're already working to improve the lives of children and families on a daily basis. So when disaster strikes, we want to respond, and we want to respond quickly. We do this by preparing and pre-positioning relief supplies so that when disasters hit, we can respond quickly with relief items like food, water, hygiene supplies, household kits, and cleanup materials. Our goal is to supply short-term needs to help families rebuild their lives and livelihoods and help communities become stronger and more resilient. So how do we respond? Disasters have different stages. There's rescue, relief, recovery, and rebuilding stages. We don't do the rescue part. We leave that to emergency management professionals, and we make a point of staying out of their way so that they can do the most important part of disaster response, and that's saving lives immediately. But after that rescue phase is over with, and relief organizations can start doing work, we move in as quickly as possible, and we'll send in deployment teams so that they can assess the situation. After we assess the situation, that means distributing relief supplies through a strategic network of partners, and those partners are community-based organizations, churches, schools, and governments. We work with local community partners in order to limit our footprint, because after a disaster, there are usually limited resources, so we don't want to take up more hotel rooms because there might be people that are displaced that need a hotel room. So we go in with limited staff on the ground, and we try to work through community organizations that weren't impacted by the disaster or limited impact by the disaster, and work through them because they also know the community better than we do, and we're limiting the footprint so we're not putting a strain on the community. We'll also use cash-based programming to meet unique needs of individual families. Many times after a disaster, people aren't working because businesses are shut down and people don't get paid. People might not have insurance, or there's gaps in insurance. They might not qualify for FEMA aid or for whatever reason, but they might have lost everything. So our cash-based program, it helps families fill in those gaps by quickly getting money to disaster survivors so they can start putting their lives back together. And so who do we help? We at World Vision are always trying to help the most vulnerable people, and we'll help anyone that has been impacted by a disaster with relief supplies, but we're usually looking to partner with organizations that are already serving people in need already before the disaster hit. People in poverty are impacted by disasters much more than people with means. People living in poverty are less likely to have support systems such as family help, savings, or insurance. They're also less able to navigate federal help resources and many times miss out on available aid due to lack of knowledge. In the wake of disasters, there's a lot of chaos, and there are many organizations trying to help. Although we do, as disaster relief agencies, we communicate and collaborate. There are sometimes areas that might be missed, and when we go into a disaster, we're always searching and seeking out to help people that aren't already being helped by other organizations. Because a lot of times the media drives responses, or people will, like their hearts will be open because they saw something in the media and want to respond to one certain area, but some rural areas might be left out. Whenever a disaster strikes a city, there's usually a lot of response, but a lot of rural areas do get looked over sometimes. And then, as Jenna from IRT said, this past year has been busy. These are just the responses that we did in the U.S. We go by a fiscal year calendar that goes from October to September, and with our with our response, when we go in, especially when areas are hit hard and there was a lot of need beforehand and there was a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done, we'll continue the response as long as we possibly can if there's still a need. And so some of our recent events this past year, the Arkansas flooding in the spring, we're continuing. We've been working on the border migrant response for about a year along the whole Texas border from Brownsville to El Paso. And Hurricane Irma hit an area of a lot of rural farm workers in this one centralized location, and we continue to help there. And as you can see through this chart, we just concluded Hurricane Harvey just this past March. So we tend to go in, provide some relief, but then we try to stay in for the long haul until the rebuilding process. And then these are just, this is like our impact for the year. We've had 11 disaster responses in the U.S. alone. We have 3 ongoing responses. We've sent in 79 tractor-trailer loads of relief supplies to survivors of the disaster. And we've served over 127,000 people in this past year alone. And with donors and people that support us, the biggest thing that I can say is thank you. I've been deployed to many disaster responses, and it's the little things, as Julie from the Red Cross said, like a hygiene kit when you have nothing, and a smile from a volunteer's face. It brings about hope, and it brings about normalcy to someone's life that's just been turned upside down, where they might have lost everything, their home's flooded, they're sleeping in a shelter, and just by bringing that initial sense of comfort to them does bring hope that the rebuilding process can begin. So I thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We'd now like to go to any questions from the audience. Ashley, do we have any questions?
We have a couple questions that kind of are for all 3 of our nonprofits. So one question that we've been asked was can you talk about any volunteer opportunities that any of the organizations might have that could be like local, that would only take a couple hours, or maybe even national or international that might take, days or weeks. Any sort of way that we can help as a volunteer for any of the organizations.
This is Julie. I'm happy to jump in. Yes, absolutely. One of the things that you can do either locally or internationally or just nationally with the Red Cross is you can become a disaster volunteer. And that can take on several different aspects. You could become somebody who works in a shelter and helps people in a shelter, and that could happen here in Washington State. You could travel to Florida, or you could go to the Bahamas. If you wanted to become a mental health worker, you could take the training with us and help people that are trying to cope with disaster. You could also become, if you like to drive, you could become an emergency response vehicle driver, the people that go out into the neighborhoods and distribute the supplies. So really on a local, national, or international level with Red Cross, you could become a disaster volunteer.
Hi, this is Jenna with International Relief Teams. So right now, we need volunteers who are skilled construction workers to go on week-long teams to Northern California to rebuild homes there for the victims of the California wildfires. And so if you are interested in that, and if you have some construction skills, you can go on our website and fill out the volunteer form.
Great, thank you.
Um,
Sorry.
so, and for World Vision, for our disasters out in the field, we're usually partnering with organizations that are providing volunteers. Um, so there's not usually a lot of opportunities there. But we do have a warehouse in Fife, which might be close to some of you. I know that um, people are scattered throughout the county. But and if you like more information, and that's an opportunity that could be, a few hours one time, or a couple hours once a week or once a month, and that would be helping to prepare donations. We have normal U.S. Operations, but we also do ship relief supplies out of that warehouse when we respond to disasters. So that is a way to help in the volunteering part. And I could share the link once we get done with this.
Great, thank you. There was a kind of along the lines that you were just talking about. Can you talk about how we can keep abreast of what's going on? If you guys have any social media that we could follow, or websites that we could visit to get the latest news from your organizations?
Yeah, this is Jenna at IRT. You can follow us on Facebook at International Relief Teams. It's all one word. Or on Instagram at IR Teams. And we're always posting there about our current work and what we're doing and volunteer opportunities.
And this is Julie, like Jenna, Red Cross. The most up-to-date information that you can get on Red Cross is on our Facebook page as well. We have a Red Cross Northwest page that is for Washington State. And then if you want to go to American Red Cross, you can have our national site. And we use our site on Facebook for if there's a disaster. This would be the place that you would go to find out where shelters are open, where you can drop off supplies. Also, you can see volunteer opportunities, but also just really on a day-to-day basis, that is the best place to keep track of what Red Cross is doing every day.
And for World Vision, for social media, we have the larger organization, which would show all our international work, and that would be World Vision USA on Facebook. And for our U.S. programs, which this would show you a lot of stuff that's happening out of our Fife warehouse, and also a lot of our local or domestic disasters. That would be World Vision U.S. programs, and I'll share the link on the chat when we get done.
Great, thank you. There was a request if you could share those links that you mentioned in the chat for everyone. That would be greatly appreciated. And then I guess the final question, which was touched upon, was how do your organizations coordinate your efforts, since you guys kind of work in the same areas for disasters?
This is Julie. I'll start. I tend to be on the fundraising side, so I'm not always privy to exactly how all of the disaster coordinating goes, but I've been around enough to see that before anything happens, Red Cross is partnering with national and community government agencies, and really just trying to kind of fill in the gaps of Red Cross doesn't do every part of what happens in a disaster. So we are looking for the partners who fill in those gaps, and creating those partnerships year round so that when something happens, there's just a call made, everybody comes together, and we respond really honestly as a community.
Yeah, this is Jenna. Sorry about that. So I think we operate similarly, where we're always working with a partner on site because we are such a small organization. We have an office in California, and then and that's it. So we can't always be on site, Because we are a small, lean staff. It just means that we try and use the funds, the donations we get, as efficiently and effectively as possible. So we work with partner organizations on the ground to either assist with our volunteer teams or who are helping with the distribution of the supplies that we send.
And another way we as organizations communicate, I'm not sure if International Relief Teams is, but the Red Cross and World Vision and multiple organizations that work in disasters are part of a network and an organization called the National VOAD, which is National Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. That's a mouthful. But we coordinate there through that because, as Julie said, every organization in disaster relief doesn't do it all. So the Red Cross is providing shelter, and we could come in and provide supplies. And we try not to duplicate our efforts and serve the community as best we can. So the communication goes through this network of VOAD, and we work with the local emergency management teams when a disaster happens. And also every state has a FEMA representative that is a conduit to volunteer organizations. So that way, FEMA isn't getting bombarded when they're trying to do their operations. They have like this one point of contact, and they help coordinate and keep everybody abreast of the situation.
Great, thank you, everybody. Those were the questions that I had.